Hola, estoy muy entusiasmado el día de hoy porque estoy con la doctora Elizabeth Dori Tunstall. Dori, estamos muy contentos de tenerte en el Tecnológico de Monterrey. Bienvenida a México, bienvenida a Querétaro, bienvenida a Guadalajara. Has hecho un recorrido por nuestros campos. Gracias por estar aquí.
Pues gracias por la invitación.
Y muy contento de poderte entrevistar. Ya fue tu conferencia en Querétaro, que fue fantástica.
Gracias.
Y nos dejas muchos temas en que pensar, así que tengo aquí 200 preguntas, 200 questions for you. Pero intentaré ser breve. En tu conferencia comenzaste hablando de poner primero a los indígenas. Es incluso parte del primer capítulo de tu libro, ¿cierto? Sabes que en México tenemos una riqueza cultural y étnica enorme. Sin embargo, pues no está del todo representada en la escena contemporánea del diseño. ¿Qué debiéramos hacer? ¿Cuáles serían tus recomendaciones para poner a los indígenas primero en la escena contemporánea del diseño?
I think first, and I was speaking a little bit about this earlier this morning, is actually having pride in your indigenous heritage. It's interesting, right? Because if you go to the museums, that's like what you promote in many ways, right? Or whenever there's an Olympics, that is what you promote, right? As kind of the national heritage. But there's still, I guess there's a sense of still needing to embrace the indigeneity of the multiple ethnicities, right, that are represented here in Mexico. So I think in places where I've seen there's been a shift, right, in terms of putting indigenous first, the first part is just really the people, the cultures, communities really just having pride in their indigeneity, right? And then from there, part of demonstrating that pride is to make it presence, like an indigenous presence in the city, indigenous presence. And design is the most amazing vehicle by which to be able to do that, right? So in places where I've seen, like in Canada, there is a greater sense in the last 20, 30 years of indigenous pride. It's happening more so in the United States, where I would have conversations with colleagues that if they could hide the fact that they were indigenous, maybe 20 years ago they did, but now them and their children are proudly indigenous. So I think to put indigenous first is to recognize the indigeneity that is present, embrace that as something positive, right? That's something that defines in many ways the uniqueness of your identity of a place, the uniqueness of your identity as a country. And then from there, design all the things that make that pride amplified, right, throughout society.
Gracias. Y sobre todo esta idea de la diversidad y riqueza, de entender la diversidad de valores y culturas y maneras de estar en un lugar, por ejemplo, como México, que tiene esta diversidad tan grande. En tu libro haces una crítica sobre el proyecto europeo moderno.
Sí.
Y cómo ha sido, pues, colonizante, sobre todo desde la idea de los valores universales, ¿verdad? Como únicos, que podrían, así en una aspiración, aplicar a todo. Yo le añadiría que este proyecto europeo moderno ha estado enraizado en las escuelas de diseño, ya que mucha de la fundación de las escuelas de diseño en Latinoamérica, por ejemplo, ha tenido esta influencia muy positiva en muchos sentidos, porque así se ha nutrido la disciplina del diseño, pero por otro lado también has sido partícipe de esta idea de la modernidad. ¿Cuáles son los riesgos de asumir este proyecto europeo moderno, digamos, sin crítica?
Yeah. Well, I think, so I try to be very gentle in my critique, because I think, so let's just say, the project is the story that we tell specifically about design as something that happened in Europe in the 1800s, right? And through this great modern design, that you would be able to have progress through technological advances for the masses, and you would have this feeling of universal humankind because people would let go of their Germanness or Italianness or Frenchness or whatever. And in the context of Europe, in the 1800s, these are quite utopian and universal ideas, right? And it makes sense, like Europe is a place that you've had conflict between the English and the French and the Spanish and the whatever for thousands and thousands of years, costing lots of lives, costing lots of money. I mean, the colonial project in and of itself was to gather still resources, right, from the New World to be able to pay for the wars in the Old World, right? So that ideal is quite utopian. The ideal in a place where you have an aristocracy that owns everything. The ideal of having a better life for the peasantry, again, quite utopian. But it's only for that very specific context, right? So I talk about the Bauhaus, like the project of the Bauhaus as a modern project was to rebuild the bodies and the spirits of mostly, again, white European men who were traumatized by their experience in World War I. So the notion of white walls, right? That's to prevent, post-traumatic stress disorder because you see some image that might trigger your experiences of the war. The ideal of having, getting rid of like German black letter or the motifs of like an Italianate design, that's because just the year before that you were fighting against Italians and Germans. So the whole ethos of the Bauhaus was really, how do we prevent post-traumatic stress disorder in white men who experienced World War I? Yet we've made that our entire standard, right, of design. And so for anyone who is not a white male who's experienced post-traumatic stress disorder from war, then you actually feel quite alienated from these environments because, let's say, you might come from a cultural context of lots of color. Well, all of a sudden, that color goes away because you're trying to aspire to an aesthetic that's not for you, that's not for your context.
Unos valores ajenos, ¿verdad? Unos valores.
Sí. And so it is, because it has been the foundation for many art and design institutions, right? Because we've bought in this story, craft is bad, right? Or craft is not important. Art is too elevated, right? So we need design as for the rest of us, for the masses, right? But in that imagining, it's like the masses may only be like 1% of the entire human population. So how do we expand our imaginings of who we're designing for, who we're trying to build a good life for through the design, which means in some ways we can take what's useful about these ideas. Like again, the ideal of providing a good life for the masses, that's a good idea. We just have to be expansive in how we do it, because the way they tried to do it in Europe doesn't align with the context that might exist here. So you have to find your own way of doing it. And then again, we know because of all the conflicts that exist today, the notion of like letting all of your ethnicity go to be part of a universal humankind doesn't work. So how do we create a context for lots of diversity without hierarchy, right? Because the harm in all of the work that's been done in terms of the modernist project is that they've established this hierarchy that said their model of design is the standard by which all other design should aspire. And it is not our context to aspire to, so we need to find our aspiration in the context of our daily lives, in the context of the environment around us and the people around us.
Gracias, sí, cómo no hay una superimposición de valores, ¿cierto?
Sí, sí.
Y creamos jerarquías.
And the problem is the values, right? Like, so again, the techniques in terms of like point, line, plane, all those things are actually quite useful because it was about, like, as human beings, we do see in a particular way that might align with a grid, right? So those things are actually still useful. It's just the underlying values of who it's for and how it's meant to operate is the problem. So we need to develop values that are aligned to the context of how we build a good life for everyone where we are at.
Me imagino. Incluso, ¿qué significa a good life, no? What is the meaning of a good life? ¿Qué significa y qué valores aspiras? ¿A qué valores aspiramos, cierto?
Yeah.
En tu libro conectas esa idea que me pareció muy interesante del proyecto europeo moderno con el, a ver si lo traduzco bien, bueno, es el Better Living Through Technology, vivir mejor a través de la tecnología, que a mí me resonó muchísimo. ¿Podrías comentarnos un poco más? Porque también en países como México, me atrevo a decir Latinoamérica, hemos tratado de, durante la modernidad, tratamos de crear, digamos, modelos propios, ¿no? Clara Porcet, que en México, por ejemplo, ella, bueno, cubano, mexicana, decía que el diseño debería de reconciliar, decía ella, lo hecho a mano y lo hecho por la máquina. Sí. Entonces, el diseño debería ser ese actor que lo reconcilia para el bien de la sociedad. Entonces había un ethos, un sistema de valor detrás que debiera ser así, que al final es un tema de justicia social, ¿cierto? También, entonces, ¿podrías comentarnos sobre esta idea del vivir mejor a través de la tecnología, cómo se ha impregnado y qué condiciones crea?
Sí. So the notion of better life through technology is the underlying assumption of that. Like, why do we create technologies as human beings? We are not faster than most animals or creatures. We don't see as well. We don't have enough fur to keep us warm. So we've always had to develop technologies to augment, in many ways, the weaknesses. What we call our high technologies now, what a lot of them are about in their underlying way of working is just allow us to calculate faster, right? So let's make it faster to figure out how to solve this problem, make it faster, right? So the problem with the technology, so how that does to the better living through technology is that we all know that labor, right, is the most expensive part of any kind of process, right? So the ideal of better living through technology is to make things cheaper and faster, right? The technology allows us, in almost all cases, the goal is to reduce the labor so that you don't have to pay people for what they're contributing and what you make. So there's a little bit of a flaw in that thinking already, because the impetus is, I don't want to pay people to work. The value of their work, I don't want to pay them.
Sí, no precisely, I want them to feel to live better.
Right. It's
but
like
I don't want
the process of living better is for me not to pay them the worth of their labor. So this is where it becomes then, so in craft, right, in making by hand, the labor is very apparent, right? And in many cases, it's operating almost like the opposite of efficiency, because in many ways, it's the slowness of the process that is meant to guarantee the sustainability, right? So you take what you need in terms of materials, it takes a long time to do it, so you can't take as much, right? That it seeks in many ways to, and again, craft normally fits into the gaps of, let's say, an agricultural production cycle. So it's, again, after the harvest is done and you've done all of that, you have a little bit of gap of time. And so that's normally when craft happens, right, to fill the time. What happens when you ask craft to be a full-time job, then you begin to look for efficiencies, right? And then that, again, that notion of efficiency is, how can I pay you less for your labor than how less can I get away with paying you for your labor? And the technology in some ways is meant to, again, helpful in some ways, right? So it takes out repetitive processes that might be difficult for the body, right? So the body to removing the body from the process, then again, it goes to that ideal of this labor is not valuable, right? And we don't want to pay for it, even though we'll spend millions in technology. That's all to say is that technology is always good when it is augmenting the weaknesses, let's say, of the human body. The skepticism that I have around artificial intelligence is that, like human beings, we actually have no weaknesses in our ability to think, right? We still don't have cameras, for example, that can see as well as the human eye. Like, I look at a picture, I take a picture, my eye has captured it better than what is in the picture, right? So where we begin to move in technology is we're moving to technology to replace and not augment. And when you replace people, the attitude that you have to have when you're wanting to replace people is that these people are not valuable, right? The work that they do, the way that they live is not valuable. So we need to change our consciousness around what technology is and what it's supposed to do and how it is supposed to support and augment humans, not replace them, right?
Gracias, Dori. Nos dejas, como en tu conferencia, muchísimos retos y temas en que pensar. Quizá una última pregunta. En la conferencia dejabas una frase, la voy a leer. Diseñar objetos que transmitan alegría liberadora al cuerpo y a las comunidades. ¿Cuáles serían tus recomendaciones para, esta es una entrevista para nuestros estudiantes, sobre cómo vivir esto en su vida y en su ejercicio del diseño?
Well, and that's part of like changing that underlying consciousness of why you're making. So if you're making to make things more efficient, you should maybe investigate that more, right? But if you're making to create liberation for people, if you are creating in order to make joy, and joy comes from like connection, right? Joy comes from being connected to other human beings. Joy comes from being connected to the earth, right? So we know that those things are what bring us joy. And in many of our indigenous societies, when they made things in order to facilitate connection, right? So facilitate a connection with higher deities, to facilitate connection with the animals, to facilitate connection with the rain or the sun, or all of those things that we are interdependent on in order to live. A lot of things that we design now feel that they're being designed from a perspective of separation, and part of that's that colonial project, right? That colonial built-in, the effectiveness of colonialism is that it was able to separate people enough that they couldn't form together in solidarity to overthrow the economic structure that was being put in place, right? So designs that connect us, and connection is the source of joy. Designs that liberate us from, in many ways, the harm that comes to our bodies through the way in which we are used, right, to work, and not necessarily always work for our benefit. That what I'm asking for in some ways is that the next generation of designers reorientate their value system of why they're making to make things that bring liberatory joy. And you know, in the question and answer before, it's like you may start really, really small. Like someone will say, all you can do is do the layout of this particular page. When you approach that task, think about it as like, what is it can I do to make the experience of interacting with this joyful? What is it that I can do that helps people think in a broader and more imaginatively liberatory way? And then you may become an administrator and you're facilitating, again, a curriculum that supports liberation and joy. And then you may be a city planner, and then you're designing a city that does that. But you can start very, very small in that practice of liberatory joy. And then the things that we make will be more diverse, will be more inclusive. And if we think of the process of colonization as separating people from each other and separating people from the land, then it'll reconnect us to one another and reconnect us to the land. And like I said, that's where the joy comes from.
Gracias, Dori. Reconectarnos y preguntarnos el por qué diseñamos y por qué hacemos. Es una gran pregunta. Muchísimas gracias, Dori, otra vez por estar aquí en México, por visitar el Tecnológico de Monterrey, por esta charla y además por hacerla en inglés-español, que creo que es la primera que hacemos así, que fue muy, muy rica. Te agradezco mucho nuevamente.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.